What do Andrew Schultz, Idris Elba, and Jack Black all have in common? They all have a foot fetish. Although it's said to be the most common of fetishes, for those without, it's puzzling and therefore ripe for judgment. So, in true curiosity fashion today, we're going to learn about it. My next guests are a PhD sex educator, a woman whose partner has a foot fetish while she doesn't, and a man who has a foot fetish along with his wife and who are also the hosts of the Foot Fetish Podcast. Three guests, one fantastic conversation that will hopefully get you talking as well. Curious about souls and society, feet lovers and friends, Dr. Carol Queen, Ramon, and Nicole. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Hello.
Really, it's so good to be here.
Souls and salutations.
I'm so excited about this for so many reasons, but I want to kick this off with a short backstory, and then I'm going to kick the first question to you, Ramon.
Ooh.
So here's the backstory. A few years ago, I interviewed a woman who had been barefoot in Canada for over a decade. This inspired me to also try out the barefoot lifestyle, being a barefooter, if you will. So I tried that and really actually ended up loving it and joined a Facebook group where people would give tips. And, I would go to a conference and I'd post a picture of, hey, look, I was barefoot at this conference, which led to me getting some really interesting DMs, which then led to some really interesting family dinner conversations, during which my own husband and my own parents, in response to the question about selling feet pics, said, well, why not? They're just feet.
They're just feet.
They're just feet. So, Ramon, at the risk of sounding like a mental health therapist, when you hear people say, what's the big deal? They're just feet. How does that make you feel?
Well, I'm realistic. They are just feet. They just happen to be the greatest thing in the world to me and to those of my ilk. Jumping off of that, we feel very lucky, those of us who are into feet, because it's an extra thing for us. It's an extra point of arousal, interest, beauty, anything in between. I guess they're just feet to you, and that's fine for you to think that. Meanwhile, I might just take a peek or two if you don't mind.
Okay, Nicole, when your partner told you about his foot fetish, was that kind of your reaction? Like, what do you mean they're just feet? Or were you familiar with feet fetishes before?
I was not familiar with foot fetishes before. And when he had told me, he actually didn't tell me. We just kind of found out along the way. And, when we first started dating, he would really love to tickle my feet and take my socks off. So I was like, okay, this is playful. And then, as things got a little spicier in the bedroom, it was a lot of, hey, can you put your feet on my face? Hey, can I kiss your feet? Hey, can I do this? And I was like, whatever, as long as we're getting things going, it's okay with me.
Interesting. So you were just very open-minded to it. It wasn't like a shock or anything. And it sounds like he didn't announce it like, Nicole, I have something very important to tell you. It just sort of came up in, the way things are.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So, Carol, when you were studying sexology for your PhD, how much was a foot fetish? I am struggling so much with the plural of this. You have no idea. Feet fetishy, foot fetish. It's really, really a struggle for me right now. But, Carol, the question is, how much of this was covered in your doctorate education?
Well, we did not have Foot Fetish 101 in our curriculum. However, we did talk about the question of fetishes. And that's where, of course, foot fetishes were discussed because they're so common. They're a very common fetish. And let me just say that when we're talking about fetishes, there's a couple of ways to think about them. One is the old school classic sort of sex psych way is you've got to have this in order to be aroused or in order to come. It's crucially integrated into your own sexuality. If you don't have the thing, whatever your fetish is, too bad, it's not going to be a good night. The other one is, and this is more modern, and many people, I think, in the fetish world would also kind of feel that this is an acceptable way of talking about it. It's awesome to have an extra thing that is such a turn on. Ramon, you kind of talked like that when you were
Yes.
discussing it. Yeah. And so it's an extra special hot sort of a sexual superpower in terms of responsiveness. And somebody says they have a fetish if they like some sexual thing that they like, including feet, or they say they have a fetish. Back to sexuality, two kinds of fetishes then can be whatever it is out there, a special kitchen implement that you cannot live without, or whatever sexually, or part of the body. That's called partialism. And some people have more than one of those preferences or super hots, but many people have the one focus. And feet is the most common of those. So when we're talking about people and bodies, foot fetishes are the most, to our knowledge so far, fetish that people might have. Did I answer your question? And then some, probably.
Yes. And so, Ramon, you were giving an enthusiastic thumbs up when Carol was talking. So for you, it's like an awesome extra. Is that
My wife calls it the cheat button.
oh my gosh.
If-
I love that.
like if perhaps I'm not in the mood, perhaps it's just not the right night. If feet become involved, it's an instant moment.
I see. Okay. So this leads me to my next question for you, Ramon, is like, forgive me, right? You seem rather resilient to my naivete. So hopefully this won't come across as an
I love to
insensitive question.
educate, please.
Okay, good. Which is why we're here, right? So, what level of hotness are we talking? Like, a hot chick walks by, she's got a great ass. Are we talking ass level hot? Or she's got like some knockers on her, right? Are we talking boob level hot? Or, she's a stripper on a pole and her legs are spread. Are we talking vulva level hot? Like, where are we? When you see someone walking barefoot in public, like
I'm
what
gonna
level of hot is
I'm gonna
that?
blow your mind here. It's all of them. It's all of
Okay,
them.
that doesn't even compute.
So okay. So I'll give you a quick anecdotal example. There was a girl that I saw her. She's rather plain, not really interested. She's talking in class at some point. I hear about the size of her feet. Instantly, she becomes hot to me. I haven't even seen her feet. I just hear about the size, and instantly, I'm like, "Ooh, this just became my new crush." That's how intense it can be.
So is that confusing while being in public then? Like I live in Florida. So I mean, and also I mentioned I don't wear shoes a lot. Like I'll go to the grocery store. It's no big deal. If you saw me walking in the grocery store with no shoes, would you blush? Like would you have to like avoid me? Would it be
I wouldn't, but like I've lived it my whole life. It's been a part of my life. It's a part of my professional life. So I will certainly take a look. I will certainly continue to take a look. But then there's a level. So that gets into the
Okay.
personalities of the fetishists themselves. Like a thing I often advise fellow fetishists is don't be a creep.
That's
Yes,
good
take a
advice.
glance, but don't stare and make awful
And
comments.
definitely don't make that growl noise
Be-
for
Yeah.
sure.
Be cool.
100%.
Be cool, but we're gonna look and we're gonna keep like it's an extra set of boobs, ass. It's all there.
Oh, okay. I think that does clear it up. Okay, Nicole, this one's for you. So, what's it like to be a partner of someone with a foot fetish? Does it make you think twice before wearing, say, sandals in public?
It doesn't make me think twice of wearing sandals in public for other people, but I know what shoes or no shoes to wear in specific occasions. So if I know that we're going to go on a date night, I'm going to wear the sandals that have a little bit more peakage for my partner so that he can see and know that I'm paying attention. Just know this is for you. So yeah, it's fun. It's kind of like a tease before the bedroom.
Okay, I'm starting to see where it's like an extra. So, is it would you say it's an extra thing for him too, or is it like a requirement?
I would say it's an extra thing, but also it's definitely a cheat code. It's like the finish him, like it's the let's get this done. And I know exactly what to do.
Interesting. If you're on a double date with another couple, do they know that he has a foot fetish and would she dress differently because of that?
They do not know, hence why I am blurred.
Right. Okay. Roger that.
Yes. So not many people know that he has a foot fetish. And the thing with that is he actually doesn't talk about it. He finds it to be a very private thing. Maybe it's like because there's this stigma around fetishes in general, but I personally think it's amazing and it's something to add to my arsenal of tools to make things fun. So I'm all about it. Bring me the fetishes, guys. Bring them on.
Oh my gosh, you're such a good person. I love that. It's such a refreshing way to look at it because, I hear about people dating out there in the world. I'm married, we're monogamous, so that doesn't apply to me. And so, they were like, and then what if we're not kink compatible? And I'm like, "Oh God." Like that's not even something that entered my thinking. So, Carol, can you explain the difference between a kink and a fetish, or are they close cousins?
Well, they are close cousins, I think. And let me just say that what you said about are they kink compatible or might we be kink compatible is just a profound and good question. Because to begin with, like, let's kink and fetish come into the room as possible pluses and also as part of who our person that we're choosing or hot up for or whatever is. Like, it's a way of not cutting off an important part of their sexuality and throwing it in the trash and saying, okay, well, you can have everything else, but that's just, because people, of course, do that. That's not uncommon. And it might be one reason why Nicole's partner is like, mm-mm, I'm not going to talk about this to all the people because some people are really rude. So kink and fetish are like, a kink is basically anything that you could consider non-normative sexuality. And there's a lot of sexuality out there, and there are only very few things that have traditionally been representative as normative, right? Heterosexuality without any twists up until crazy recently, oral sex was illegal in a lot of places. I mean, there are things that we all who have sexualities that we explore but don't think of as very out there often do, like, as a matter of course, would really miss it if it went away or we got thrown in jail for it. Nevertheless, there are all these other things that we never get referenced in sex ed, except my sex ed, as part of what people experience and what to think about that and all of that. And there are, sort of conservative ideas about it. And there are progressive, don't yuck my yum about it, sort of a sex positive way of thinking about it. But anything that isn't pretty old school naked people vanilla could be considered a kink. And it goes all the way out to I'm hanging from the ceiling. It's the only thing I like. There are so many kinks. And so a fetish is really the where a kink is like sort of supercharges around not a whole human and the way you interact with them, although you will interact with a whole human anyway if you've got a human with you. But that this partialization I mentioned, where we're talking about feet today, but we could be talking about something else. And you said, what about the ass? What about the boobs? Well, there are fetishes for those too, of course. And those fetishes are so common as to not be thought of as kinks or fetishes by most of us. And yet they can be extra too. So then there's the other piece of, do you need to reach for the silk handkerchief? Maybe you don't get off on people's feet per se, but maybe if you've got the right shoe in your hand, you put it on top of your erection immediately if you get the opportunity. There are so many ways that this can play out. So there isn't a simple answer to your question, except that a kink is like this supercharged item or body part, usually. Fetish, I meant. And a kink is all the different exploratory things that you might find
Oh.
you get super into, even though, you can't talk about it with your grandmother at Thanksgiving at all. But
Well, obviously we were, because literally that question,
I
I'm pretty
loved
sure was a
that.
Thanksgiving
I loved that. I'm like, all right, this is why we need Curious Introvert podcasts because it makes your relationship with your family a lot better.
Oh my gosh.
That's my
It really
feeling.
does. It's so true. Okay, so, like, if someone says so if I'm talking to someone and this subject comes up, which it will, every time I have an episode about this, it's like for 6 months after, I'll run into people and they're like, "Hey, remember that episode you did with the swingers or the foot people?" So, like, if someone's like, "Well, I'm a boob man." Okay, so they have a breast fetish?
They could. They could. They may understand themselves as just really especially appreciating breasts and, lots of people really appreciate breasts. So it's not that
I mean, they're pretty great.
they're
I'm
very
not gonna
great.
lie.
I
I
agree.
said
I
lots of
agree.
people for a reason. I mean, there's this notion that more men have fetishes than women, but women also have such scientifically it's been studied fluid and sort of interested and open sexualities if they do that it's a little hard to gender this in the kind of way. I mean, men are more likely to have a fetish that they're like, that's my fetish. It never changes. It's, I might add some cherries on top of the feet. But if someone is, especially like if their sexuality goes boing,
Mhm.
something happens, they see someone or something, or there's some kind of, I hear from women all the time, good vibrations, right? People talk about fetishizing a certain vibrator, and if it goes out of stock, it's like a crisis. So I think we need to remember that our culture has tended to sort of put sexuality in a relatively small box. And for a few people, it fits well in there. And for a lot of other people, they're like, I'm not necessarily going to talk about what I see outside the box, but I see a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's talk about origin. Ramon, you said that you have been aware of your inclination towards feet since you were a little guy. Tell us how you figured this out.
Definitely between the ages of 3 and 5 years old, I have a memory of sitting on my teenage cousin's back, and she had her feet in the air, and me just shoving my face into her feet, and it being a core memory. And I remember looking through books when I was little and like just hyper fixating on the feet. So it was always something going on in my brain, even back then. And it just never left me from then onward.
And you have some insight into the history of foot
I
fetishes?
do. So we did an episode on the history of foot fetishism and did it in our own non-scholarlistic way. But to give you a broad overview, I mean, people have loved feet as long as there have been feet. But the specific examples that would come up, you had the foot binding practices in China when they would take a woman's foot and they would bind it in a certain way. And it would be this horribly debilitating thing. But these women got heightened status because they had what they called the lotus foot, which is this very misshapen foot. But it was so hyper sexual for the men to have this foot. And it was this, they had a certain smell to them that they loved. And from there on, there was a study they did recently that there was a hypothesis that when STD levels would get higher, foot fetishism cases would get higher, more instances of it. The study they did recently was from 1998. They looked at the past 30 years, but there have been thoughts that it went back even during times in the 17th century when there was a big outbreak of STDs. It's like, oh, they would focus on the feet more. And then you had all the different shoe styles throughout the years. I mean, you're not going to dress up your feet if no one's interested. And you have these
Hmm.
wild and crazy high heels in general. Just the idea of that, men and women, just to like show off your calves, show off your footwear and your feet. So it's always been around in one form or another. There's Egyptian hieroglyphics of people enjoying the feet, the Kama Sutra, enjoying the feet. In ancient Greece, there was a writer, Philostratus, who wrote the first poem, first written example of foot fetishism. It was called To Be a Barefoot Woman and To Be a Barefoot Boy. And it was very much a foot fetish instance. And it's awesome. I got a lot of my information from this book. A quick little plug, I guess. It's from the 70s. It's called The Sex Life of the Foot and Shoe by William Rossi, which I highly recommend. Very interesting read on the history of foot fetishism. Just put it on a weird shelf.
I mean, listen, I know we just met Ramon, but I really welcome the weird and the unusual, especially with a historical context, because it's so easy to, as I said in the intro, cast judgment on these things as like, oh, kids these days, they just can't have
Right.
normal sex. Like, well, what is normal and what causes us to say that? Like, questioning society, questioning yourself, questioning what we are programmed to desire is really interesting. And that leads me to my next question, which is for you, Carol. Where does this come from? Like, if this is the most common fetish, how is this happening? I know there's some theories. Can you share those?
Yeah. And let me also just say one bucket list thing for people who were interested in what Ramon was saying, which is that there's a shoe museum in Toronto, and they've got examples of lots of these different shoes of the past. And you can look at them and go, were people? Yeah, they were. Anyway, it's not totally clear where any of our sexuality comes from. There is a strong sentiment among some scientists that everything is inborn, from basic sexual orientation to our predilection for other kinds of interests and fetishes and kinks and whatever. Some of that might be true, but I don't think we know. Someday invite me to come and just rant about the state of sex research. I'm not going to take up our time today, but not all the sex research is what I would call 100%. But there's also that there's nature and nurture, right? So that was the nature. And one thing that shows up when you look into the nature piece. I don't know if people have heard of a particular way of studying it or understanding study of the brain called the homunculus. It's basically an image of a brain with a little sort of personage stretched over it like that, like a cat sleeping on a pillow, right? Only it's a little person. And there's little parts of the body that are bigger or smaller or closer together in terms of where in the brain the stimulus for them lives. And the genitals and the feet just happen to be pretty much right next to each other. So that's a thing. That's well, maybe it's like a neurodivergence almost. Maybe it's a particular way that somebody's wires got crossed. Although, why would we call them crossed? They're right next to each other. It's not surprising that there would be that feedback loop. I say that I'm not a brain scientist. I've just seen a lot of sex in my life. So I'm just saying, I don't surprising at all.
God bless
Love
you.
it.
So, my partner's been doing a lot of brain study lately, though, and he talks to me about it over breakfast all the time. So I feel like I'm, in the same way that Father William said I took to the law and argued each case with my wife. That's the kind of brain scientist I am. But also, then there's nurture. Whose feet did you see at an early impressionable age? Now, Sigmund Freud thought this was all, like it was all about the penis, but Sigmund Freud thought that everything was about the penis. So I think we have a guess as to what kind of fetishism Sigmund Freud was troubled by that he was trying to unravel this whole time. Brilliant guy, but he had some focus issues. He really did. So some people are like, well, another sexologist of his time frame was like, well, I was a very sheltered little kid, but then one day I was with my governess and I heard a sound underneath her long skirts that went as far as the ground. And when she moved on down the path, there was a wet spot there. She peed. Bless her heart. A lot of people will give themselves bladder infections instead of doing that, but she was sensible. And so, dude, rest of his life, he had a pee fetish. And it never changed for him. So his belief was something maybe random happens, but it's at a time when you are particularly plastic, they say. You can be especially affected by it. Your identity can be shifted by it potentially. It's like it's easier to learn a new language when you're a little kid. Maybe it's easier to get turned on to something, even though we don't call it turn on in that age range. But something is noticeable. And then when sexualization happens, boom, there it is. It's ready for you, waiting to be an extra or a focus.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. It's like I don't really want to use the word ammunition, but it's like it's kind of set up
But
that
you are
way. Like it's
preloaded in that sense. I mean, you don't have to
Yeah.
think of it in,
Yeah.
military terms or, but you are preloaded with some of what when puberty happens, when later life,
Mhm.
okay, now you're old enough to start looking around and finding people and figuring out what you're going to do with them. Then the things are already there for you to say, I've always wanted to explore that, or somebody just waved their foot in my face and I don't think I'm ever going to be the same again.
Nicole, I wanted to ask you about since learning more about this and being like a super open person with your partner about this, have you learned about like different types of foot fetishes? Because that's something I didn't know about until I was listening to Ramon's podcast, that there's like different types. Like, also, I may have gotten a weird DM about it. So,
It was me.
it was not you. And I say weird, and that's only because like this was the only time in my DM history about feet has it made me uncomfortable. The rest of them have been so polite. They're like, "Dear ma'am, I would like to see your feet and I would like to give you money." And I'm like, "Oh, that's sweet. Thank you. I'll keep that in mind." They're like, "No problem. Have a great day." Like they're just so freaking polite. But I also have learned through the other ones that, yeah, like calloused feet and dirty feet. So, like, tell us what you've learned because I feel like I'm the ultimate outsider in the four of us, and you're like one level above me.
I'm
And
just
then we
one
have
extra foot in
Ramon.
the door.
I see what you did there. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this episode is ripe for puns. I opened with one. It's just where we're at. So, yeah, so tell us what have you learned about the different types?
Yeah. So, I'm actually not that far from you, Meredith, because I learned more about it as I asked him questions, but also I did my own research to find out that there are different types of foot fetishes because there are people that love nail polish, right? And my partner hates nail polish, and I was like, "Oh, no, I want nail polish," but then I'm like, "Well, let's play a little game and see what works," you know? So if I'm mad at him, I might put nail polish on and he'll know that it's not go time. But it goes as far as, like, calloused feet, dirty feet, runner's feet, and all the different kinds of things that can cause your feet to look different, and Quentin Tarantino is a very well-known foot fetisher, and all of his films have feet in them full on the screen, so he just happens to be my partner's favorite producer, so it kinda goes hand in hand, but yeah, that's the gist of it is just kind of learning along the way, but I also kind of wanted to touch on what Carol was saying with the nature and nurture because I feel like fetishes flourish because of the nurturing aspect through acceptance and just letting it happen and being open-minded, and then you could potentially learn about a fetish that you have yourself, even if it's not feet.
Is that like you have experienced that?
Not necessarily, not yet, but I am open. I am open to learning what's out there.
I love you. That's so interesting. Yeah, I never really thought about it as mutually enhancing. When I initially learned that your partner has a foot fetish and you don't, like automatically I kind of went to this place of, oh, how cool that you accommodate. To me, there was no mutual benefit because you don't have a foot fetish. And then, like, when I came across Ramon and his wife, I was like, okay, that seems more mutually beneficial. Whereas one is like, all right. But from what you're saying, it's like, well, you never know. Am I right?
Yeah, you never know, and, there will be people out there that are a little bit surprised or icked by a foot fetish because they themselves have a weird feeling about feet, but I feel like I'm just open-minded in the way that I try to accept people for who they are and where they are, and that's what makes it possible for this to kinda work, and it honestly gives me a little bit of power in the bedroom, which is fun.
Ooh, that's true. Okay, so here's my question. I've got two more questions I would like everyone to weigh in on as we wrap up here. And the first one is whether it's feet or something else. And Nicole, I'll have you answer this one since we're already on that topic. How do you recommend a person talk to their partner about a fetish that they have or they've been wanting to explore?
It's just as simple as communication. Just talking about it and being open to talk about it and discuss about it and be adults about it to be able to know boundaries and have conversation.
Carol, what do you say?
Well, I think it's real significant that people know whether or not their partner tends to be open or tends to sort of close down with new information because that might guide the way that you bring it up. But in general, don't bring it up right in the heat of the moment. Not in bed, not during sex, and all this stuff, because that's a lot. For a lot of people, sex is overwhelming and often in a very good way, but you don't want that there. You want it over dinner when you have a private chat. You want it on a walk or on maybe on a drive. You don't want it like, oh, by the way, although it sounds like a couple of you have had relatively good experiences just kind of sliding it in. But the other thing that I want to say about this is that I think it's really important to know that some people are pretty resistant about feeling sexualized in various kinds of ways. And so this is why you have to train guys not to just, go kneel in front of people's pretty feet because often that won't work out well. So any kind of thing that you might want to talk about more, explore, etc., just be conscious of whether your partner's holding something about that. Is it holding shame or trauma? Is it holding, oh my God, once somebody did that and it freaked me out and I've never gotten over it? Or is it, I love when you're happy? It's like the polyamorous use the word compersion when their person goes out to another person and has a really great time and you think it's awesome, as opposed to the ways that many people would think, which is full of jealousy and full of, fear. Compersion, you could almost use it here. Like, it's not my thing necessarily. I haven't discovered that it is yet anyway. But if it makes you light up like that, I love it when you light up like that. Let's go.
Oh, yeah. And Ramon, what do you think?
So, speaking from firsthand experience here, and I get a lot of questions in about this, like how do I approach it? And a lot of people seem to think You have to put it out there on your dating app. You have to put it out right away. No, 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 no. So I get that it's very important to you, fellas and ladies, if it's your fetish, but mm, wait, wait. And like you said, have an adult conversation about it and don't do it on date one. For the love of God, don't bring it up on date one. The easiest way is to have a conversation about what turns you on. And then when they tell you, well, I'll tell you, you know what turns me on. And it's about honesty. It's truly honest. Be honest with yourself. I know me. If I was with a partner that wasn't open to dealing with feet, we could not continue. And that's a real question that you may have to look at. I see poor men that are in marriages for 40 years and either told their wife early on and they didn't like it and they're just suffering the whole time and saying they're suffering, or they figured it out later, or maybe they just never told them. And it's like, that's so sad to me. Have a conversation with your partner. Just don't do it on date one. Get to know the person. And usually, often I've seen this happen, is that if you love each other, if you care about each other, even if they're not 110% into doing it, they're willing to meet you halfway because they love you and they want to make you happy. That's usually how it works. That's how it happened with my wife. It started out that she didn't really quite get it, but she loved me and she was willing to explore it. And now it's almost as much as kink for her as it is for me. And she said, should we ever split up, her next partner's going to get a wild surprise when she shoves her feet in their face.
Okay, so my last question for all of you is about something I was remembering, but I couldn't verify. So take this with a grain of salt. I remember learning at some point that back in the olden days in Japan, a woman flashing her wrist while serving a man tea was considered a sexual advance. And so that got me thinking, how much of our sexuality is really a societal influence and how much of it is biology? Because to use another example, breastfeeding is not a sexual act. And yet it took Instagram 3 years to allow pictures and videos of breastfeeding on its platform. 3 years, right? And we know in Europe, topless women, not a big deal. But in the West, we kind of like lose our minds. So, Nicole, what's your take? How much of our sexuality is societally influenced and how much of it is biology?
Well, first thing I want to say is free the nipple. Everybody deserves to be topless. But I think that there is a heavy, heavy, heavy societal influence because of that perspective of acceptance. You want to be part of a crew, you want to fit in, you want to do something. But once you kind of take a step back and realize what it is that you like and enjoy, because society plants seeds of what you could potentially enjoy, what's normal, what's not, or quote unquote normal, what's not. And then you find out for yourself what it is that you like, and then that kind of shifts what sexuality and sex looks like to you as an individual.
Mm, love that. Carol?
So, our sexuality, our sexual identity, our preferences, all the things, all the mores, everything, super, super socially constructed. Sex is part of our culture, our folk ways, the way we do things. And we don't have just one culture. There's subcultures as well. And especially in the late 20th century, sexuality and preferences turned into their own types of culture in ways that they hadn't been before. So this is just super interesting stuff. And it helps us understand how somebody with the exact same shape of desire, their sexual orientation, their kink, their whatever, could think of themselves in really negative terms if they were brought up in one place and way and be like, woohoo, freak flag fly. I love my people. I found them all on the internet. We get together. And there's that whole thing too. That those two people could live each other's lives depending on where they were born. We need to understand that this is part of all of the drama that's going on in our lives right now with big picture stuff, because we don't all want the same things, think the same things. Sex is as much part of that as anything else.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about how the expression has an interplay with the actual preference and the actual way that we, live our lives. So thank you for that. Ramon?
So, as a foot fetishist, coming up as far as societal pressures, there's still a great deal of shame in the foot fetish community about who we are and what we like. I mean, it's true amongst the normal people, quote unquote, of like, having a meme of like, they've seen the one where it's like the boobs guys and the ass guys are high fiving, and then there's this misshapen guy in the corner. That's the feet guy. which is hilarious. But, it's indicative of society's opinion on the entire fetish. And even amongst ourselves, there's disagreement and shame. Like some people can't even fathom dealing with dirty feet. Some people can't even understand why you would like natural toes or why you would be submissive. There's a whole swath of foot fetish guys that are like, oh, I don't understand why everyone expects me to sub. I just like feet. So, like, even in the community, there's this culture of shame. I don't know if that's entirely American, but it's certainly in and amongst the internet community where that's a truism.
Wow, that's so interesting. I got to tell you, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you all so much for being willing to show up today and just explore this with me. It's been so fun, and I'm going to link all of your interests, your podcast. Carol mentioned Good Vibes. So for those of you that don't recognize her from the previous episode we did about antique vibrators, that is Good Vibrations store. They've got lots of fun stuff there. So we'll be linking that to check out so everyone can find all those things in the show notes. Thank you all so much. And until next time.